Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. When the Nuremberg trials opened in November 1945, the world was staring at a question so immense it hardly felt answerable. How do you deliver justice for crimes so vast, so organized, so coldly executed that they seem to defy the limits of human imagination? The Nazi regime had collapsed in on itself. Hitler was dead. Many of his closest comrades had fled or taken their own lives, or were desperately trying to vanish into the rubble of the defeated Reich. But one man didn't run, one man who had once been Hitler's chosen successor, the bombastic head of the Luftwaffe, the flamboyant aristocrat of Nazi leadership who never missed a chance to peacock in public. Hermann Göring surrendered himself in considerable style with a ludicrous amount of luggage to the American troops. At the moment he landed in Allied custody, he shifted gears. He knew exactly what was coming next, and he began preparing himself for this final stage. Not a battlefield this time, but a courtroom where international law itself was about to be rewritten. Inside the Greystone Palace of Justice at Nuremberg, 22 Nazi leaders were preparing to stand trial. Nothing like this had ever happened before. 4 nations sitting in judgment over the men they believed had helped engineer a catastrophe that killed 60 million people. It was part legal process, part public reckoning, and part stark warning for whatever future humanity hoped to build. But behind the scenes, only a few steps from the courtroom, another story was very quietly unfolding. In the cells adjoining the dock, an unusual relationship developed between Göring and Major Douglas Kelly, the American Army psychiatrist assigned to evaluate the mental state of the defendants. Kelly arrived expecting a complete monster, a raving, drooling embodiment of evil. Instead, he found something infinitely more unsettling. A man who was completely charming, disciplined, articulate, and razor sharp. A man who could actually quote poetry like the best of them, crack jokes, justify himself with unnerving calm, and, for a very brief moment, sound entirely reasonable. It was a psychological duel, a duel between a war criminal and a psychiatrist that actually exposed a truth, I think, far more disturbing than the idea of the mad Nazi fanatic. Evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it appears cultured, reasonable, even likable. And that is what makes it so dangerous. In this episode, I'm going to take you into that courtroom. I'm going to help you explore how Göring turned the dock into his final stage, how the Allies tried to construct a new kind of justice, and what Göring's relationship with Douglas Kelly reveals about power, responsibility, and I also think the alarming normality of the people who commit extraordinary crimes. And I should also say, I've just finished reading Jack L. High's extraordinary book, The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, which has now just been adapted into a new film starring Russell Crowe. I can't wait to see it. From the shorts, it's gripping, it's unsettling, and I think it's going to cast a very cold light on the man we're dealing with today. So, without much ado, let's begin. When Hermann Göring took his seat in the dock in late 1945, he wasn't simply another defendant. He was the most senior surviving architect of Hitler's Third Reich. He was also a First World War hero who became a Nazi Party enforcer, head of the German Air Force, an economic czar, and for years, Hitler's chosen heir. But to understand how Hermann Göring ended up in the dock at Nuremberg, I have to rewind just a little. Göring was born on the 12th of January 1893 in Rosenheim in Bavaria and raised in a world that was actually steeped in the old hierarchies of uniform and privilege and imperial prestige. He spent part of his childhood living in an actual castle itself, Wildestein, owned by his godfather, who was also his mother's lover, a wealthy Jewish physician and merchant named Hermann August Wilhelm Epstein von Matrenburg. Göring grew up surrounded by aristocratic rituals, titles. He was used to uniforms, and also, I think, the intoxicating sense that he belonged to something grand and immutable. From early on, he was drawn to the military life. He was rebellious at school. He was sent off to one of Germany's elite officer academies aged 16. And from there, he became a professional soldier just as Europe was sliding towards catastrophe. During the First World War, Göring transferred from the infantry to the air service, and it was in the sky that he found his fame. He became a fighter ace. By 1918, with the Red Baron dead, Göring briefly stepped into his shoes, taking over command of Manfred von Richthofen's legendary squadron, the Flying Circus. He also won the Pour le Mérite, the German Empire's highest military honor, and with the very un-German, unapologetically French name awarded to officers for extraordinary military merit, especially in combat. Germany's defeat in 1918 radicalized the entire country. It set the stage for Hitler's rise and for Göring's own transformation. After the war, he spent a few years flying commercially in Denmark and in Sweden as a commercial and aerobatic pilot. But if truth be told, nothing in civilian life satisfied him. He returned to Germany in 1922 and joined Adolf Hitler's National Socialist movement. And he brought something the party desperately wanted: celebrity, military glamour, connections, swagger. And he was very quick to put it to work. As a decorated officer with star power, Göring was placed in charge of the Nazi Party's street fighters, the brown-shirted SA, the original paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. During the failed beer hall push of November 1923, when Hitler tried to seize power in Munich, Göring was shot through the groin. Doctors gave him morphine for the pain, and he developed a brutal addiction that would follow him for the rest of his life. After the push collapsed, Göring fled into exile while the party crumbled, but he returned when the government foolishly issued amnesties and political fortunes shifted. By the late 1920s, he was back at the heart of the movement, one of the Nazi Party's most effective power brokers. Elected to the Reichstag in 1928, he rose to its presidency by 1932 as the party surged. When Hitler took power in 1933, Göring moved with astonishing speed. He became Prussian Minister of the Interior. He built a complete police state. He purged officials, promoted loyalists, empowered thugs. He created the Gestapo. He opened the first concentration camp at Oranienburg, where victims of the regime were held under the chillingly named policy of protective custody. Essentially, illegal imprisonment accompanied, in many cases, by torture and then murder. The titles and honors continued to pile up. By 1935, Göring commanded the newly reconstructed Luftwaffe. By 1936, he was economic czar under the 4-year plan, overseeing the vast rearmament program that rebuilt Germany's military. He was also placed at the center of the state-sanctioned plunder. He seized Jewish businesses, stripped occupied territories of their wealth, raped their museums, and funneled immense fortunes into both Hitler's and his own pockets. And then there was Kahn Hall, his grotesquely ostentatious country estate, some 120 hectares, a monument effectively for his ego. It had a lion cage. It had a 400 square meter model railway fitted with tiny aircraft capable of dropping little wooden bombs. It housed his enormous private art collection, made up largely of looted masterpieces, works stolen from Jewish collectors, from museums in Paris and Brussels, from artistes labeled degenerate. At the outbreak of war in 1939, Göring still stood firmly as Hitler's chosen successor. In 1940, Hitler elevated him to Reichsmarschall, the highest military rank in the Reich, created specifically for him. Göring, of course, designed his own uniform for the occasion, but the arc of that relationship, like so many arcs in the Nazi regime, would bend sharply as the war progressed, and not in his favor. In the early years, Göring was the charming fixer. He cultivated vanity the way some men cultivate roses. He was loyal, he was attentive, and superbly useful. One of the essential conduits through which Hitler's ambitions became reality. But the gigantic pressures of the Second World War exposed his limits with brutal clarity. It always happens. Put someone in control who doesn't have the experience, and the organization suffers. The Luftwaffe failed to defeat the RAF in the Battle of Britain in 1940. He had promised Hitler he would win it in a matter of weeks. His empty boasts about crushing Soviet industry evaporated the moment the German advance stalled. And when the Sixth Army was encircled at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942, Göring promised Hitler that his air force could supply them. It was complete fantasy, and of course it was catastrophic, and it cost hundreds of thousands of lives. And of course by then his reputation was not simply tarnished, it was collapsing. And as the ground war ground on, as the promises piled up, as the rivals like Himmler and Bormann whispered poison into the Führer's ear, Hitler listened, and Göring, once the golden favorite, found himself sliding into irrelevance. By April 1945, with the Reich crumbling and the Nazi leadership disintegrating around him, Göring's relationship with Hitler imploded completely. And this, I think, is where this story becomes extraordinary. While Berlin was being pounded into dust, Göring actually wasn't there. He was sitting in one of his palatial retreats in Bavaria, surrounded as ever by complete luxury. Watching events unfold from a safe distance. For years, he had been Hitler's designated successor. But as defeat became inevitable, Göring made what he believed was a perfectly reasonable move. He contacted Hitler with what he thought was a polite, practical question. Just let me know when you'd like me to take over the government. I mean, it's hard to imagine the mindset that he was in when he sent that message. Hitler, of course, went berserk. Paranoia was eating him alive at this stage, and he saw Göring's message not as loyalty, but as treason. In a fit of rage, he ordered SS troops to arrest him, perhaps even to kill him. A death squad was dispatched to Göring's residence, and in one of those strange late-war moments where fanaticism meets farce, Göring simply managed to talk them down. He persuaded the SS group that this was all a misunderstanding, that everything was fine, that there was absolutely no need to execute anyone today. But of course, it didn't matter. The damage was done. Hitler then stripped Göring of every title and privilege and appointed Admiral Karl Donitz, a man utterly loyal but with no political base, as his successor. For Göring, it was the final humiliation, and he knew the game was up, so he fled. He made his way south towards Austria, desperate to avoid capture by the advancing Soviets, who were infamous for their treatment of high-ranking Nazis. The Americans, he thought, would be more civilized, and they were the ones he wanted to face. As the war wound down in its final hours, Göring set his sights on the American lines, and in typical Göring style, he made an entrance. He drove up to the American positions in his luxury Mercedes, stepped out, announced who he was, and then politely asked the soldiers if they wouldn't mind unloading his luggage. I mean, can you imagine the absurdity of it all? And of course, they were stunned. They'd been told to expect desperate, fleeing men, half-starved, half-feral. And instead, what they get is Hermann Göring presenting himself as if he were checking into a hotel. And Just to finish on the luggage, what luggage it was. Not the looted impressionist paintings that you might expect. Those were long gone. But thousands of tablets of paracodeine, the drug that he was now hopelessly addicted to. In the chaos of the war's final years, Göring had managed to corner almost the entire global supply of that narcotic, and he carried hundreds of boxes of the stuff, alongside trunks of clothing, lavish jewelry, rings, and associated trinkets, all stolen from museums. Even at the end of everything, he traveled like royalty, and he was a man weighed down by his baggage, literal and physical in every sense. And just like that, the most second powerful man in Nazi Germany surrendered, not with drama, not with defiance, but with theatrical self-importance and an extraordinary lack of shame. Once in the American hands, Göring instantly became the most senior Nazi in captivity. And among the Allies, there had already been a fierce debate about what to do with men like him. Churchill had actually suggested lining the top Nazis up and shooting them. Others, Roosevelt among them, argued for a trial, a real one, not a kangaroo court, but something that would set a legal precedent for the world to follow. Göring naturally believed that he should be treated as a head of state. He still imagined, unbelievably, that he might lead a post-Hitler Germany under Allied supervision. But the Allies had no such illusions. From the moment that he was captured, he was treated as a prisoner and dealt with very firmly. His first stop was Mondorf-les-Bains, a spa town in Luxembourg where a former hotel had been converted into a makeshift prison for senior Nazis. The building was once luxurious, but it had been completely stripped out. The rooms were bare, they were military, they were humiliatingly plain. This was no Khan Hall. And Göring spent the first 3 weeks of his captivity alongside other members of the Nazi elite in this strange purgatory, a place that had once served champagne, but now served cold rations and military discipline. From Mondorf, they were transferred to Nuremberg, and the choice of that particular city was no accident. Nuremberg, for all the bomb damage, had something crucial: the Palace of Justice, complete with a functioning courtroom and an attached prison. Yes, it needed rapid repairs, but it could be used. And symbolically, it was perfect. This was the city where Hitler had staged his enormous rallies in the 1930s, the place where the Nazi Party had strutted, shouted, and promised a 1,000-year empire. To hold their trial, there was a deliberate act of theater. The stage on which their rise had been choreographed would now host their fall. Inside the courtroom, judges from all 4 major Allied powers presided: Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States. The British judge, Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence, served as the presiding authority. And the scale of the task facing the prosecutors was staggering. They had to build a case covering years of atrocities across multiple continents, including crimes so unprecedented that the legal language for them barely existed. But the Germans, in their obsession with paperwork, had left behind mountains of incriminating documents. And there were survivors, tens of thousands of them, whose testimonies would become the backbone of the prosecution's case. It was a race against time, a monumental effort conducted in the ruins of a defeated nation. And into this tense, tightly wound atmosphere strutted Hermann Göring, calm, confident, and ready to turn the most important trial of the 20th century into his final performance. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. It was an immense undertaking, a prosecutorial mountain. The Allies had only a few frantic months to gather years of evidence, to decode it, to understand it, and to assemble it into a coherent case. The trials were scheduled to begin in November 1945. Göring and many of the other defendants had only been captured that spring. It was a blisteringly fast timeline, and yet the trial went ahead. But what interests me most isn't the mountain of paperwork, nor the logistics of the courtroom. It's the strange, unsettling relationship that developed between Hermann Göring and the U.S. Army psychiatrist assigned to examine him, Major Douglas Kelly. Douglas Kelly was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, raised in the beautiful mountain town of Truckee at the north end of Lake Tahoe. He went to medical school in California, and once America entered the war, he enlisted immediately. The army sent him to Western Europe, where he worked in a series of military hospitals treating soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue or shell shock. And of course, now we recognize that to be PTSD. And the numbers were staggering. In some theaters, especially North Africa, up to 75% of casualties were psychiatric, not physical. Kelly's job, in effect, was to take shattered men, steady them mentally, rebuild their confidence, and then send them back to the front lines where they were needed. And he was very good at it. Very, very good at it. He was innovative, he was respected, and he was trusted. So when the war ended in the spring of 1945, Kelly was already nearby, experienced, high-ranking, and available. He was sent first to Luxembourg and then to Nuremberg without any clear idea of what he'd be doing there. But once he arrived, his orders became crystal clear. His job was to evaluate the 22 top Nazi defendants to determine whether they were mentally fit to stand trial. Legally, the bar was low. They had to understand right and wrong, and they had to comprehend the charges against them. 21 of the 22 met that criteria immediately. But I think Kelly saw something else, perhaps an opportunity. He realized he'd been handed what every psychiatrist of his era would have considered the ultimate case study. The most notorious criminals of the 20th century, all gathered in one place, all available for one examination. While the world saw monsters, Kelly wanted to see patterns. He wondered if there was such a thing as a Nazi virus, some shared psychological defect that could explain how these men justified such horrors. And so, with the army's general blessing, though not with any real understanding of the part that he was actually aiming for, Kelly transformed his assignment into a vast psychiatric project. He administered Rorschach ink blot tests, personality inventories, storytelling assessments, IQ measurements. He conducted hours upon hours of interviews, sitting face to face with each man in his cell, probing their memories, their logic, their beliefs, their evasions. And Göring, out of all of them, fascinated him the most, because in many ways, Göring was not the buffoonish figure that many people imagine him to be today. To Kelly, he was brilliant, he was charming, he was witty, he was theatrical, and he was endlessly manipulative. He was a decorated First World War fighter ace with genuine courage. A man capable of immense cruelty, but equally capable of dazzling intelligence. He had presence, overwhelming presence. When Göring entered a room, even if you didn't see him, even when he was in captivity, even when he'd been stripped of his medals and power, you knew that something special had happened. Kelly soon discovered that talking with Göring was like fencing with a master swordsman. Everything was rapid, clever, and flamboyant. Göring could twist a question, redirect a line of inquiry, flatter, bully, disarm, or seduce. Sometimes all within the same conversation. He was, as one observer put it, terrifyingly normal. And that is precisely what made him so compelling and so dangerous. Kelly went to Nuremberg expecting to find madness, and instead he found intelligence. Distorted, corrupted, yes, but fierce. And the more he listened, the more he realized something far more disturbing than insanity was at play. Göring was actually sane, fully sane. And I think that is the real horror. When Douglas Kelly first examined Hermann Göring, he didn't find the swaggering Luftwaffe chief from the newsreels that he'd seen. He found a man in terrible physical condition. Göring was bloated, he was weak, and he was addicted to paracodeine and suffering from major heart problems. The Allies were desperate to prevent any of the top defendants from falling ill or, worse, dying before the trial began. Justice needed to be seen, not deferred by a conveniently timed heart attack or an overdose. So Kelly's first job was actually to detox him. And he did it in the only way guaranteed to work on Göring. He actually appealed to his ego. Kelly told him that very few men could throw off a dependency like this, but that someone of Göring's legendary willpower might just be capable of it. Göring, of course, agreed immediately. Within weeks, he was off the drug, he was losing weight and regaining sharpness. He enjoyed the idea that he was winning yet another contest, this time against his own addiction. But as Göring's body recovered, Kelly began to study the man beneath the uniform. And I think to his surprise, Kelly found something not entirely unlike himself. Both men were highly intelligent, driven by powerful egos, and convinced, dangerously convinced, I think, that they were rarely ever wrong. Göring had charm too, a lot of it. He could be funny. He could be self-deprecating. He told jokes about himself to his guards. He even told jokes about Hitler. But Kelly was not fooled by the humor or the theatricality. He saw the coldness beneath it, the complete lack of remorse, the absence of empathy, the bloodlessness with which Göring discussed decisions that had led to millions of deaths. Sometimes Göring feigned innocence, claiming certain atrocities happened deep within the bureaucracy, beyond his view. But at other moments, he openly doubled down. He defended the persecution of Jews. He defended the war of annihilation against the Soviet Union. He was fully prepared to justify the final solution. Yet, he maintained, with breathtaking cynicism, that he had never been an ideological anti-Semite. He insisted he joined the Nazi Party simply because it was small and it was easy to rise within and full of First World War veterans, the kind of men he believed could bring down the Weimar Republic. He presented himself as the patriotic opportunist, the organizer, the man who used Nazi programming rather than believed in it. And this, for Kelly, was one of the most revealing insights of all. Because Göring, in Kelly's assessment, was not insane, and neither were the other defendants. Kelly had arrived at Nuremberg expecting to find pathology, delusion, psychosis, some defining psychiatric rot, but instead he found men who fell squarely within the normal psychological range. And I think more than anything, that's what terrified him. If these men were normal, then normalcy itself could not be trusted. And I think Kelly realized that the world would always contain people like Göring. Intelligent people, ambitious, emotionally cold, people hungry for power, willing to trample entire populations just to get it. Not just in governments, not just in armies, but in business, in education, in corporations, in communities, anywhere that hierarchy and ambition met weak resistance. The war ending, he concluded, would not end these crimes. The trial would not end the crimes. Even the founding of the United Nations would not end these crimes. And he believed very squarely that humanity would always carry these people among us. Kelly concluded it was up to everyone else, the ordinary, the empathetic, the humane, to recognize them early, resist them fiercely, and never assume that evil must look like a madman, because sometimes it looked like Hermann Göring. Charismatic, disciplined, intelligent, and terrifyingly ordinary. Göring, on the other hand, was also not an easy man to prosecute. Far from shrinking under the weight of the evidence, he relished the stage. He spent his early months in captivity plotting exactly how he would behave once he reached the witness stand. The trial, he knew, was inevitable. His testimony also inevitable. And Göring decided that he would use the moment not to repent, but to defend everything the Nazis had done. All of it wrapped in the language of loyalty, patriotism, and duty. When the trial opened, the prosecution began in grand style. Robert Jackson, the chief American prosecutor, delivered an extraordinary opening statement. He was eloquent, noble, and devastating. Observers there thought it was unanswerable. But then Hermann Göring took the stand. And for a while, astonishingly, he dominated. He turned the witness box into his final theater. Confident, articulate, even witty at times, he launched into long, polished speeches defending the Nazi regime. Jackson, unprepared for this barrage of propaganda and rhetorical flair, he struggled. Göring had the upper hand, and the world saw a man who was no buffoon, but a master manipulator fighting for his own legacy. His downfall finally came when the prosecution produced the mountains of paper evidence, orders bearing his signature, authorizations enabling the Holocaust, instructions that left no room for denial. Faced with documents he could not explain away, Göring's defense finally collapsed. When the judges retired to consider the verdict, there was no doubt he was guilty, and he was then sentenced to death by hanging. The execution was set for the 16th of October, 1946. But Göring had no intention of allowing himself to be hanged. Hanging, in his mind, was for criminals, for thieves and common men, not for a former head of state, certainly not for a Reichsmarschall. Many of the defendants pleaded for a firing squad, which they saw as more dignified, but of course the Allies refused. What the Americans didn't know was that Göring had smuggled cyanide capsules into his prison with him, hidden in his luggage from the day of his capture. And although the details remain mysterious, the most likely explanation is that an American guard had developed a quiet trading arrangement with him. Göring would give him jewelry, rings, gemstones, exchanged for small favors. And of course, one such favor was retrieving the cyanide. On the night before his execution, Göring broke open one of the capsules hidden in a jar of cold cream in his cell. He bit down, the poison flooded through him, and he died almost instantly. It was the final act of defiance, a last attempt to control the narrative. He had denied the Allies the spectacle they intended, and he chose his own ending. His suicide was a disaster for the Americans. It humiliated the guards, the prison administration, and the Nuremberg authorities. And it raised questions, uncomfortable questions, I have to say, about lapses in security. And again, the parallels about things like this that have happened recently are uncanny. Douglas Kelly, back in the United States, by then read the news like everyone else. And his reaction was, I want to use the word complicated. He was shocked, certainly, but he also felt a strange flicker of admiration. Göring, ever theatrical, had staged his own finale with characteristic arrogance. He had refused the rope, refused the judgment, and refused to bow. So that then had me wondering about the relationship between Kelly and Göring. And I don't think it was ever a friendship. Kelly knew too much about the man's cruelty, his emptiness, his hunger for power. But there was a kind of recognition there, a mutual fascination. Both men were brilliant. Both were driven by ego. Both understood manipulation instinctively. Each knew the other was performing, testing, and probing. Kelly came to realize that they were alike in many ways, frighteningly alike. And that perhaps was what unsettled him most. Because if Göring was not insane, not monstrous in the way people wished him to be, but instead simply human, intelligent, ambitious, emotionally cold but psychologically normal, then the world held many others like him. The war had ended, but the type of man that Göring represented would always exist, would always rise, would always seek power. And I have to say, folks, I think that is the darkest lesson of Nuremberg. In the end, what stayed with Douglas Kelly was not just the shock of Göring's suicide, but the meaning behind it. Göring had used cyanide not merely to escape execution, but to make a bold statement, one final act of control, one last gesture of defiance. Kelly knew exactly what that meant. And 12 years later, Kelly would take his own life the very same way. People often ask whether Kelly was actually consciously imitating Göring, but the truth seems subtler and darker. Kelly, I don't think, was thinking, I will die like Göring. It was the effect of Göring's suicide that lodged itself in him, the dramatic flourish, the refusal to surrender to another man's judgment. In the final troubled years of Kelly's life, marked by personal collapse, marital strife, intense drinking sessions, and I think also professional turmoil, that kind of exit must have held a terrible appeal. Two men utterly opposed in morality, but drawn to the same method, the same reason, the desire to seize the final word. And yet Kelly's most important legacy wasn't the manner of his death. It was the conclusion he carried out of the Nuremberg cells, a conclusion many found far more unnerving than in the courtroom. He had come to Nuremberg expecting to diagnose madness. Instead, he found normal men. The Nazi defendants showed no rare psychiatric disorders, no exotic syndromes, no virus, if you like, of evil. They were, in almost every measurable way, psychologically ordinary. They were type A workaholics, men obsessed with mission and hierarchy. Many of them lacked empathy or simply didn't care what their decisions did to others. But you know what? These traits were not exotic. They're actually painfully familiar. Kelly realized that if you call such men monsters, aberrations, freaks of nature, you absolve them of responsibility. But if they fall within the normal human range, as Kelly concluded, then they remain responsible for every choice they made. They were not compelled by madness. These guys actually chose evil willingly. And that, Kelly believed, was the most frightening truth of all, because if men like Göring sit inside the broad band of normal humanity, then fascism and authoritarianism are not historical freak storms. They can rise anywhere, at any time, in nations with strong democratic traditions. And let's face it, folks, they already have, and they still do. So Kelly's insights explain not only how the Nazi leadership behaved, but how power behaves in every age, including our own. Just to finish this story, Nuremberg, I don't think, was ever about one man's punishment. It was about establishing a precedent that would echo across history. For the first time, the architects of a war of annihilation were held publicly, legally, and unambiguously to account. And beneath that courtroom, in the quiet spaces of the prison, Douglas Kelly left with a revelation that still matters today. It's so important that the capacity for extraordinary harm does not lie at the fringes of humanity, but uncomfortably close to its center. Nuremberg was a reckoning, yes, but it was also a warning to the future. Structures matter. Accountability matters. Vigilance matters. Because history is not shaped by villains hiding in the shadows, but by confident, charismatic men who sound reasonable enough as they dismantle the world around them. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.